I didn't usually do much babysitting, but I needed money to pay some bills, so when I saw a last-minute job posting, I decided to take it. A couple needed someone to look after their 4-year-old son for a few hours while they went out for an important dinner. The house was in a quiet part of town and seemed like an easy job since the boy would be asleep for most of the time. I arrived around 8 in the evening. The parents, Felipe and Claudia, greeted me hurriedly at the door, dressed elegantly and ready to leave. They gave me the basic instructions. Their son, Gabriel, was already asleep, and I just needed to keep an eye on him until they returned around midnight. The house was large but cozy, with modern decor and numerous security cameras installed throughout. This made me feel a bit more secure, as they seemed to be cautious about safety. Once they left, I went to Gabriel's room to check on him. The boy was sleeping peacefully, breathing softly under the covers. Everything seemed too calm, so I went back to the living room, sat on the sofa, and turned on the TV to pass the time. About an hour later, the house phone started ringing. I found it odd since no one uses landlines much anymore, but I answered it. On the other end, there was only silence. I said hello again, but no one responded. I thought it might be a wrong number and hung up, turning my attention back to the TV. But 5 minutes later, the phone rang again. I answered once more, and this time, a soft, almost whispered voice asked, "Have you checked his room?" My heart raced immediately. I asked who was calling, but the line was abruptly cut off. The phone went silent suddenly. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I remembered the security cameras around the house and decided to check the monitor in the kitchen. Maybe it was just a prank from someone who had the house number. As I reviewed the camera footage, everything seemed in order. The hallway was empty. Gabriel's room was quiet. Nothing unusual. I decided to brush it off, but the feeling of discomfort wouldn't leave me. About 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. My hand trembled as I answered, and once more, the same voice whispered, "He's not safe." The call was cut off again. This time, I didn't wait to find out if it was just a prank. I went straight to Gabriel's room. The boy was still lying there, but something seemed different. The blanket was slightly askew, and he wasn't in the same position. As I got closer, I realized he was awake but said nothing. He just stared at me with wide-open eyes, as if he knew something I didn't. With my heart pounding, I left the room and went back to the camera monitor. I reviewed the footage from the past few minutes, trying to see if anyone had entered the house. But what I saw terrified me. A strange figure, standing in the corner of the hallway, nearly invisible due to the shadows. It wasn't moving, but it was there, present, watching. I ran back to Gabriel's room, but he remained motionless, staring at me with those large, frighteningly attentive eyes. I tried calling the parents, but the phone was out of service. I went to the landline, but before I could dial any number, it rang again. "You shouldn't be there," the voice said. "He's in danger. Get out now." At that point, the tension became unbearable. I dashed out of the room, grabbed my bag, and without thinking twice, left the house, leaving the door open. I called the parents as soon as I was safely outside, and this time the call went through. I explained everything that had happened, and they were frightened but didn't seem as surprised as I had expected. When they returned, they paid me quickly and said that these things happen from time to time. That didn't make sense to me. I never understood who was calling me or why they seemed so resigned to the situation. Since that night, I never accepted a babysitting job without knowing exactly who I was dealing with. I've always been very close to my cousin, so when she asked me to watch her 5-year-old son for the night, I agreed without a second thought. She and her husband needed a break, and since it was a quiet Saturday night, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to help them out. I arrived at their house around 7 in the evening. My cousin's husband was already out, and my cousin was almost ready. She explained that little Matthew had a few favorite toys, and if he got restless, I could let him play with them. However, she made a special request. She asked me not to touch a particular chest in his room, as it contained some old toys that he used to be afraid of. I found the request odd but didn't dwell on it. I agreed, and my cousin left in a hurry, saying she'd be back before midnight. Matthew was sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by cars and building blocks. He was a quiet child, different from what I remembered from the last time I saw him. For the first few minutes, he seemed calm, but as the evening progressed, I noticed he kept looking towards the hallway as if he was waiting for something. I decided to divert his attention and suggested we watch a cartoon, which worked for a while. He settled down and I started to relax too. The house was eerily quiet, almost too quiet, except for the occasional sound of the wind outside. But soon Matthew became restless again. He looked at me and said in a low, almost timid voice, "I want to play with the other toys." "The other toys?" I asked, somewhat distracted. He nodded and glanced towards the hallway again. That's when I realized he was referring to the chest my cousin had mentioned. I felt a bit uneasy remembering the warning, but my curiosity got the better of me. Besides, how frightening could a bunch of old toys really be? I decided to open the chest. At first, it seemed ordinary. There were cloth dolls, wind-up toys, and other old items, slightly worn by time. What caught my attention was a small porcelain doll placed at the bottom of the chest. It was impeccably clean, as if it had never been used. When I picked it up, I felt an inexplicable shiver run down my spine. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just because I was handling something so old. I set the doll aside and let Matthew pick another toy. He chose a tin car and started to play, seemingly content. The tension seemed to have eased. However, soon after, the living room lights began to flicker. I looked around, trying to determine if it was an electrical issue. I got up to check the switches, but they seemed to be functioning properly. Then I heard a noise, something falling in the hallway. I went back and found the porcelain doll on the floor, turned on its side. I thought it might have fallen when I moved the chest, so I put it back, but something felt off. I felt a slight unease and decided to close the chest again. However, Matthew, who had been quiet up to that point, started to become agitated. He looked at me with frightened eyes and said, "They don't like it when you close the chest." I frowned, not understanding. "Who, Matthew?" He just pointed to the chest without saying anything more. I decided to drop the subject and return to the living room, trying to ignore the chill I felt. The lights stopped flickering, but a heavy feeling took over the house. I began to feel as if I was being watched. The wind outside grew stronger, and I struggled to stay calm. Matthew played as if nothing was wrong, but suddenly he stopped, looked towards the hallway, and whispered, "They're coming." Before I could react, I heard soft, yet distinct footsteps coming from the hallway. The sound was clear, as if someone was walking slowly towards us. I froze. The only other person there, besides me, was Matthew, who remained seated, expressionless. The sound stopped abruptly at the entrance to the living room. I looked towards the hallway, but there was no one there. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the wind had moved something. Maybe it was just the floor creaking. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. That's when the porcelain doll appeared again, this time in the middle of the hallway. I was sure I had left it in the chest, but there it was, as if placed there deliberately. That was the last straw. I grabbed Matthew, said it was bedtime, and took him to his room, trying not to show the panic I felt. I locked the bedroom door and sat next to him, praying for time to pass quickly. Finally, when my cousin and her husband returned, I left the house as quickly as I could, without offering many explanations. To this day, I don't know what was wrong with those toys, but one thing I do know, they didn't want to be ignored. I was in need of some extra money, so when a friend of my mother mentioned she needed a babysitter for her son for a few nights, I agreed without hesitation. The job seemed straightforward, taking care of an 8-year-old named Lucas in a large modern house. The only specific instruction she gave, quite firmly, was to avoid entering the room at the end of the hallway. I found it odd but didn't question it. After all, it was a family home. I arrived at the house in the early afternoon. Lucas's mother, Mrs. Marta, was a serious but polite woman. She explained Lucas's routine and mentioned that he was a quiet child, though sometimes a bit stubborn. Before leaving, she reiterated the warning about the room at the end of the hallway. "You don't need to worry about that room. It's locked, and there's nothing in there anyway." With that, she left, leaving Lucas and me alone. The evening started off normally. Lucas was a quiet boy who entertained himself easily with his toys and video games. After a while, he lay down on the living room sofa and seemed oblivious to everything around him. Then I heard a noise coming from upstairs, from the hallway. I went to check, thinking it might be something from outside or similar. However, at the end of the hallway, near the room Mrs. Marta had mentioned, there was a faint scratching sound. The noise was low but persistent, as if someone was trying to open the door from the inside. I froze for a moment, but then Lucas appeared behind me and calmly said, "It's just the locked room. They always do that." His words unsettled me, but I thought it might just be the child's imagination. Kids have a tendency to make up strange stories to get attention, I reasoned. I decided to ignore it, returned to the living room with Lucas, and continued the evening. The odd thing was that as time went on, the scratching noise became more frequent, as if someone or something was trying to get out. My stomach churned, but I kept trying to ignore it. Around 10 at night, I put Lucas to bed, and he fell asleep quickly. I sat on the sofa, watching TV, but couldn't shake the scratching noise from my mind. It was eating away at me. Finally, my curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to investigate the locked room. I took a spare key from the kitchen keychain and headed to the end of the hallway. The scratching sound stopped as I approached, as if they knew I was coming. I felt a shiver run down my spine but turned the doorknob and opened the door. The room was completely empty. No furniture, no boxes, nothing that could have caused the noise I heard. However, something on the floor caught my attention. Deep scratch marks, as if someone had clawed at the wood. They were fresh. As I turned to leave, I felt a cold breeze, and the door slammed shut behind me, locking itself. I tried to open it, but the key no longer worked. I began to pound on the door, shouting desperately, but no one could hear me. I was trapped in that empty room, with only the scratch marks on the floor for company. The scratching sound returned, but now it came from inside the walls, as if something was trying to break through from within the walls. After a few minutes, the door finally opened on its own. I ran out without looking back and decided to wait on the sofa for Mrs. Marta, trying to convince myself it was all just my imagination. When she arrived, I hesitated to tell her what had happened. However, before leaving, I saw her lock the door again, without saying a word, as if she already knew everything. At that moment, I understood there was something in that room that should never have been opened, and that I should never have gone in. I left that house with the firm conviction that I would never accept a babysitting job there again.